No, not me, dude. Not fucking me. Come on, man. I'm the press.
I get you.
Don't need to fucking aim it. Why even aiming that shit at me, man? I'm like not the fucking press. Please de-escalate.
Shame on you, fucking Nazi pigs! That is very dangerous. That is a stun grenade. Are you serious right now? Maybe you guys should just go ahead and record me, bro. This is me. This is my job. You're not going to intimidate me. We still have a First Amendment in this country.
This video is about ICE, but don't worry. It's not going to be just another rehash of the data that we already know. If for whatever reason you're not already versed in all the evidence proving that the Orange Dawn's justifications for massive militarized crackdown on undocumented immigrants is bullshit, I'll include a separate explainer to this video on the Mad Sociologist blog. That being said, it is worthwhile to note one little tidbit that is so obvious that most sources, including myself, neglect when talking about this issue. Illegal entry into the United States is a misdemeanor. It carries a fine and possible jail time of just 6 months for a first offense. That's it. The most common offense, overstaying one's visa, is just a civil offense. How do we justify using what amounts to heavily armed mass terror squads to enforce a misdemeanor? What's going on? The bottom line is, if you and I know that the drummed up fear-mongering around undocumented immigrants is bullshit, then the administration also knows it's bullshit. I'll go so far as to suggest that much of the MAGA movement knows it's bullshit. And yet, this administration is willing to spend billions of dollars a year and God knows how many man-hours to fight a war against immigrants it knows is bullshit. Could it be that there's more to this story than just a simple matter of the politics of bigotry? I'm going to make the claim that there is. This video approaches the immigration debate a little bit differently. Yes, there's something to be said about the politics of bigotry and selling fear and hatred to the paranoid pockets of our politics. It's low-hanging fruit. This video is going to focus on what I call the aesthetics of cruelty and its role in perpetuating the kind of state-sanctioned violence that we currently witness, and how it reifies state violence for potential next steps in this rising authoritarian regime. I'll also offer some analysis to suggest that this aesthetics of cruelty sows the seeds of dissent and can serve as a locus for resistance against state-sanctioned violence. Last week, the president, along with the Praetorian governor of the Free State, Ron DeSantis, announced the grand opening of an American concentration camp for immigrants. It's located in the Everglades and is thus called Alligator Alcatraz. A great deal of commentary, even from the coiffed commando, emphasized the large predatory reptiles, alligators and pythons surrounding the facility, acting as de facto prison guards with razor-sharp teeth, employed to keep real Americans safe from dangerous middle-aged housemaids and roving bands of roofers and farm workers who are just really, really scary for some reason. As it turns out, I lived in the Everglades for 6 years, and I've also hiked and backpacked across the Big Cypress and other preserves throughout the Everglades. I've been through the Everglades on foot, on canoes, on airboats. I've seen a lot of alligators and snakes in my time, as well as spiders the size of my hand. I can tell you from first-hand experience, a hypothetical escapee from Alligator Alcatraz is more likely to die from exposure to the elements than he or she is to be attacked by an alligator. So, why emphasize the alligators and snakes? Because the image that is conjured of an immigrant being eaten by a predator is much more violent and dramatic than that of an immigrant dying from heat stroke. It's about creating an aesthetic of cruelty. What does this mean? By aesthetic of cruelty, I mean a deliberate and strategic use of fearsome and violent imagery used to reify and legitimize state power and state-sanctioned violence. Alligator Alcatraz, El Salvador's Seacot prison, and I'm sure there are more to come, are not just authoritarian solutions to the so-called immigrant problem. Last April, I wrote an essay called The Spectre of the Prison. In this essay, I elaborated on liberal, authoritarian, and democratic discourses on prisons. For authoritarian, the prison is not just a means of reform or retribution. The prison is intended to be an ever-present specter, signifying the power of the state and its relationship with identified those people. The existence of what amounts to a concentration camp surrounded by reptilian predators isn't just a prison. It's a monument to the power of the state and its intent with regard to immigrants and those who look like immigrants. It's a constant testament to immigrant and immigrant-associated groups of exactly where they stand in relation to the state. A great example of the use of the aesthetic of cruelty was when Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, or as I like to call her, Gestapo Barbie, posed in front of an overcrowded cell featuring half-naked inmates. She was explicit about her warning. If you're among those people, you may end up in this Central American gulag and will never leave. This wasn't a gaffe. This was dehumanizing theater with two intended audiences and two important functions. First, striking terror in those people, the targeted outgroup. If you're an immigrant, it's not about your papers or legal status. If you're one of those people, legal or not, it's best for you to leave or make yourself scarce. You are not welcome here. The second is to galvanize support from the base, the in-group, that revels in the pain and suffering experienced by the outgroup. To MAGA stalwarts, an establishment like Alligator Alcatraz is a kind of sadistic authoritarian porn. The only thing better would be footage of someone actually getting eaten. That's the money shot. When word gets out about what is happening in these prisons, torture, humiliation, degradation, it's just part of the grotesque storytelling intended by the aesthetic. Kilmar Abrego Garcia reported that while at CCOT, he was forced to kneel for 9 hours, beaten if he could not sustain this position, and forced to soil himself as he was denied bathroom breaks. The Guardian reports stories of people forced to eat like dogs in a Miami immigrant detention facility. In Broward, a 44-year-old Haitian woman died, allegedly from denial of medical treatment. According to the report, quote, the jail was so far beyond capacity, some transferring detainees reported that they were held for more than 24 hours in a bus in the parking lot. Men and women were confined together and unshackled only when they needed to use the single toilet, which quickly became clogged. For most of us, these stories are atrocities that should be investigated and prosecuted. For MAGA, this is what those people deserve. Which brings us to ICE. Immigration and Customs Enforcement isn't just the administration's racist enforcement arm. It's Gestapo. ICE, in their presentation, evokes the aesthetic of cruelty embraced by MAGA. Let's do a little mental exercise. What should police look like in a small d democratic society? When I think about police in a democratic society, I think about someone who stands out as a police officer, perhaps light blue uniform with their name and symbols of authority, such as a badge, maybe a cool hat. They represent authority, but are approachable. They're equipped to deal with people at their worst moments through de-escalation and reason. They're lightly armored with non-lethal weapons to be used as a last resort. Yes, perhaps there are special units to deal with situations of exceptional violence that will look different, but when it comes to enforcing misdemeanors and civil offenses like immigration violations, standard street-level policing should suffice. But that's just me. So I ran this thought experiment through AI. I asked various apps to describe a police officer that one would define in a democratic society driven by democratic values. Each described an officer in much the same way as I described above, trained in community service, de-escalation, and human rights. I then asked the apps to generate images of such police. Here's what they came up with. Yeah, they're all white. We still have some work to do. A couple of women though, that's good. Police in the United States do not look like this. Now, I've done videos on policing that cover some of the reasons for this, and it's more complex than I have room to get into here. If you're interested, I posted the links in the notes on the blog. But going further, I followed the same process to generate images of police in an authoritarian state. I got images of police in black, menacing uniforms. One app just added a mustache. But none of the AI came up with anything resembling this. This is what happens when Stephen Miller and Tom Homan institutionalize their wet dreams. Is there any universe in which we need teams of men dressed like this, running around disappearing people for committing what amounts to a misdemeanor? This is clearly not about law enforcement. This is about state-sanctioned terrorism. The ICE uniform is another example of the aesthetic of cruelty. It is intended to represent the overwhelming power of the state and its relationship with those people. Again, the function is to instill fear in the outgroup and awe in the in-group. Now, it's important to understand this aesthetic is nothing new in American policing. In fact, dehumanizing violations against our rights committed by the police have a long history. The militarization of police, the likes of which culminated with ICE, goes back over 50 years. In 2013, Radley Balco wrote an important book called Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police forces. He points out that militarized police emerged from the formation of the first SWAT team in Los Angeles. SWAT teams spread across the country, getting a special shot in the arm with the so-called war on drugs. That this all started in Los Angeles may seem ironic in light of recent events in which the current administration sent the National Guard into the city in response to protests against ICE actions. But it's not ironic at all. The citizens of Los Angeles were certainly offended by the presence of ICE in their communities, but they were no strangers to militarized policing. That may be why Angelenos were not as intimidated by the heavily armed masked crusaders of immigration and customs enforcement. For them, such a presence is just another day. Indeed, when it came to state violence in LA, most videos reveal the most likely perpetrators were Los Angeles police officers, not the National Guard nor ICE. As Governor Gavin Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass were quite rightly criticizing the Tangerine Tyrant for his militarized policing of harmless people, it was the police under their jurisdiction who were targeting journalists with non-lethal rounds. But I digress. Militarized policing gained traction under the war on drugs. I mean, it's obvious that a war requires a militarized response, and when it comes to funding wars, you can't beat good old Ronald Reagan. According to Balco, in a talk before the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the Reagan administration was responsible for ramping up the militarization of police for the sake of fighting the drug war. Quote, "We're talking machine guns and tanks and helicopters, armored personnel carriers, grenade launchers. Stuff designed for use on a battlefield is now being given to local domestic police departments for use on American streets." And look, blaming Reagan for most of the shitty things we have to endure today is one of my favorite things, but this isn't a simple Republican-Democrat thing. Both sides played a role in the phenomenon of militarized policing. Regardless of who's to blame, here we are with Central American gulags, concentration camps surrounded by reptile predators, mass terror squads snatching working people off the street, all to the applause of the paranoid elements of our polity, which at this point represents about half of active voters. And we can't confront this movement without condemning the imagery that motivates them. Aesthetic movements reify social constructs at an emotional level. In other words, they're designed to evoke an emotional response to social action. It's a cyclical process. A discourse emerges, an aesthetic movement results from the rising discourse. This aesthetic reinforces the emerging discourse at an emotional level, further legitimizing the discourse. So what is the contemporary American fascist aesthetic attempting to instill in the national identity with this aesthetic of cruelty? In this case, the aesthetic of cruelty emerged from the discourse of war. We can argue that this discourse of war goes back to World War II, a real war that embodied a total war mindset, a discourse in which everyone from the battlefront to the home front was engaged at some level. This discourse on war, however, outlasted the actual war. It became central to the Cold War, then the war on drugs, then the war on crime, the war on terrorism, now a war on immigrants, liberals, Enemies of the people like the press and university professors, radical Marxist scum and vermin. The discourse of warfare infers that whatever the problem, it constitutes more than a social concern that needs to be resolved. Rather, it is an existential threat that must be eradicated. It's eating our pets! Militarism is a central feature of fascism. In his book, Rising Fascism in America, Anthony DiMaggio notes, quote, "This hyper-militarism remains an important integral component of American neo-fascist politics," end quote. As with all fascist regimes, militarism isn't just about the military. It insinuates itself into the domestic sphere. Another checkpoint on DiMaggio's list of fascist features is paramilitarism and the mobilization of mass violence. At first, this paramilitarism takes the form of what amounts to domestic terrorist organizations. In Italy, Benito Mussolini mustered his thuggish squadristi, or black shirts, to intimidate political opponents. Adolf Hitler followed suit with his brown shirts. Once the fascists take control, this paramilitary approach is legitimized by the state and given police functions. That's what we're seeing with ICE, as we saw with the Gestapo and the SS, or the Milizia Volontaria in Italy. In the United States, we have red hats, right-wing militias and groups like the Proud Boys. They can buy flak jackets and police accoutrement on Amazon with free delivery. That makes the distinction between military, police, and paramilitary yahoos almost impossible to discern. If you're going to fight a war, there also must be an enemy. Today, it's the criminal immigrants. It has been the terrorists, the communists, the super predators, the drug lords, and these scapegoats are still around. They'll be pulled out by either party whenever the ruling elite needs an enemy to justify huge state expenditures for police enforcement, even despite the fact that crime is actually at a 50-year low. The aesthetic of cruelty is a predictable response to fear-mongering and scapegoating those people. It is part and parcel with a those people discourse. If those people really are dangerous, if they really are animals, vermin, criminal psychopaths, as portrayed by those in authority, then we need to use whatever weapons at our disposal to defeat them. This aesthetic also has a reflexive quality. Seeing large, heavily armed soldiers in our streets, masked to protect their identities like Spider-Man, then the enemy must be really dangerous. The aesthetic of cruelty is also a means of drumming up support from the base. Seeing a mass violent response to people one has been conditioned to hate and fear is satisfying. It's communicating that our leader is taking care of us, that he's addressing the threat, and reinforces in the minds of the in-group that the out-group really is dangerous, and that our leader is protecting us. In other words, it reinforces fascism. Finally, the aesthetic of cruelty has one more goal. That is, to normalize state violence. Seeing armed masked terror units in the street is probably the most un-American thing in the world right now. Right now. But once upon a time, seeing armored vehicles and black-clad police in riot gear was unthinkable. Now it's expected. We already saw this in action. The left responded with disgust and resistance to the presence of ICE in LA, but seemed to ignore the violence being perpetrated by the LAPD, and that's not like the left. What does that say about how this aesthetic of cruelty has distorted even those among us who are critics of state power? So, what's the big picture? I can't leave you without zooming out a little bit on this phenomenon in historical context. Where can we expect this aesthetic of cruelty and ramped up militarism to go? For at least the last 45 years, the United States has become one of the most unequal nations in the advanced world. It is also one of the least meritocratic nations in the advanced world. Working people have watched as their prospects for a better life for themselves and their children have been eroded to the point of non-existence. Many analysts see this economic insecurity and inequality as the determining factor in the rise of right-wing populism, fascism, and even a growing number of people turning to left-wing radicalism. Regardless of how you look at it, the center is not holding, and the center is liberalism, an ideology that has driven U.S. development since the founding. When inequality becomes burdensome, however, when a majority of people in a nation do not believe they have a fair shake at success and their social status does not reflect their aptitude and work ethic, it becomes destabilizing. There are 3 strategies for dealing with destabilizing levels of inequality in a society. The first is the current liberal approach. Do nothing. Or at the very least, don't do so much that one rocks the liberal boat. Maybe some minor reforms, some little tax incentives. Overall, things are good enough. Look, unemployment is historically low. GDP is growing. Everything is fine. MAGA will come around at some point. We certainly don't want to give credence to the lefties. Yeah, this strategy tends to convince large swaths of the population to embrace a strongman who's willing to reflect their grievances in his rhetoric and scapegoat those people to justify his power grab. The left, or progressive strategy, is to equalize. Tax the wealthy more, empower unions, raise wages, worker protections, provide social safety nets, and access to public goods. This strategy leads to the social democratic societies that tend to be the most stable in the world. However, the wealthy are not fans of being regulated and taxed. And when the wealthy have a disproportionate level of political power, as they do here in the post-Citizens United States, they tend to push for the third strategy, the conservative strategy. Increase state coercion against those most impacted by inequality. Increase policing of poor, marginalized communities, locking up more of those people. This means increased levels of state legitimized violence, declaring war. To justify this approach, there must be an other or a those people who can be scapegoated. First, they should be blamed for the inequality. Real Americans would be able to get ahead if it wasn't for those people moving in on your opportunities. Then, framing those people as a threat to everything you know and love. You know the left loves those people. They want to replace you with those people. Those people are out to get you. They hate you for how much better than them you are. For decades after the Great Depression, the United States used more or less the social democratic strategy, and it worked, again, with exceptions largely shaped around race. The economic elite hated this, but there was little they could do until the stagflation of the 1970s. They pinned this crisis on the tax and spend liberals and leftists and the welfare queens living large on the taxes paid by hard-working, in other words, white Americans. The conservative movement was able to take command by the 1980s, and the third strategy has been on the rise ever since. And it must be pointed out that inequality has also grown ever since. And social safety nets have either been cut or have not been able to keep up with the needs of a deindustrializing nation. Meanwhile, police budgets have grown. Military budgets have grown to the point of surplus, allowing the military to arm civilian police departments through a program created in Section 1033 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 1990, referred to as the 1033 program. This program delivers surplus military material to police departments. And when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. ICE terror squads are just the most recent manifestation of this trend. And if you think they're going to stop with terrorizing immigrants, you're mistaken. There's exactly zero indication from the current administration that it intends to do anything to ameliorate growing inequality in the United States. They just passed one of the worst pieces of legislation for working class people in American history and continue to erode services that working people need just to get by. This will have an impact on quality of life, disproportionately on the working class, a large chunk of the MAGA base. Will the negative consequences of their vote be enough to convince MAGA to see the light? I don't put much stock in a sudden humanistic and democratic awakening among MAGA. Furthermore, there are major disruptions waiting for us on the near horizon. Large language models, what we call AI, are going to disrupt labor patterns and power. We don't know exactly how and what the ultimate result will be. Either way, the labor market will be permanently transformed, and it's not looking like it will be transformed in such a way that serves working people. Economist Yanis Varoufakis predicts the rise of what he calls techno-feudalism. And feudalism means lords and serfs, and such a system does not work out for the serfs. If he's right, this new ruling class, the owners of cloud capital, will need a trained military in the event that the serfs take to pitchfork politics. Another major disruption that has already started is global climate change. We could have done something about this decades ago. We could have equalized in the interest of preserving the global ecosystem. But conservatives decided that it would be better to just let the global ecosystem collapse for the sake of preserving profits. When the time comes, and it will, militarized force will be used to control and corral the climate refugees. And there's more gators in the Everglades to serve as de facto guards. Again, the political class can start shaping policy to deal with the challenges that we'll be facing. But when you have a hammer, when the crisis points are reached, you can bet that an executive order or an act of Congress will expand ICE's jurisdiction. The coiffed commando has already admitted that he hopes to turn his deportation machine against naturalized citizens, and maybe even natural citizens. He knows the direction he wants to see the nation take, and it's not in yours. Some time ago, I elaborated what I called the 3 laws of institutional power. The first of those laws is that the primary function of any institution is to perpetuate itself. That means once the immigration crisis is resolved in reality or in the minds of the citizens, ICE isn't just going to pack up its masks and flak vests and take jobs picking tomatoes in our now empty fields. No, they're going to expand their mission to include targeting you and your family. We have the infrastructure of violence, an aesthetic of cruelty. You can bet that those in power will continue to use it. We already know this. The big balderdash boondaggle that was just recently passed triples ICE's budget and sets aside $170 billion for immigration enforcement for the next 4 years. You think that's just going away once the war on immigrants is declared? Mission accomplished? Psst. Come on. That's a lot of scary masks and flak jackets. They're going to use those things for something. So us on the left or in the center who are aghast at the aesthetic of cruelty, we're already working to turn this sick tide. If there happens to be someone on the right watching this video up to this point, first, kudos to you. Way to seek out opinions that you don't agree with. You go. Secondly, this impacts you as well. It may not seem like it, but it will. The good news is that discrepancies between rhetoric and reality are not easy to hide. In the age of universal pocket video cameras and mass sweeps, and wars are horrible, when the reality of a war is exposed against the rhetoric, reality often turns the tide of public opinion. It has become impossible for the human consequences of MAGA's inhumanity to be hidden from the world. We've all seen the videos online. Zuckerberg and Musk may be able to tweak the algorithm to make it harder for us to access these images of innocent people being mauled and assaulted by mass terror squads, but they can't stop it. We've seen the assaults against human dignity, and anyone with any level of empathy can only be appalled. Furthermore, these are our neighbors who are being assaulted, who are living in fear. Many of us don't have to access Instagram or TikTok to witness the aesthetic of cruelty in action. We can just go for a walk. When these mass terror squads are scaring children in our parks, this is happening right in front of us. Your most sadistic MAGA sociopath may see this as titillating, but most of us recoil. That's why polls are now indicating that citizens are moving left when it comes to views on immigration. It turns out that when you talk about menacing those people, I may be inclined to support your cruelty. When those people turn out to be Jose, my neighbor whose children were just at my kid's birthday party, well, that's not what I thought you meant. For most people, the real-life consequences of the aesthetic of cruelty is grotesque, and this offers an opportunity of resistance, using the very aesthetics that has been created to further this inhumane politics. We need to share the real-life narrative of the real-life cruelty that is being played out before our eyes. Share those reels and images of our neighbors being victimized by the masked terror squadristi and call it what it is. In this video, I've referred to ICE as a masked terror squad. That's what it is. The intent is to spread fear through a population and force political motivation. That's the very definition of terrorism. Don't candy coat it. We need to call fascism fascism. We need to confront MAGA with these horrors that they're perpetrating on the people we care about. They need to see that the cruelty they celebrate merits nothing more than stigma and condemnation. Instead of an aesthetic of cruelty, reasonable, sympathetic, and empathetic people, the majority of us, can demand an aesthetic of humanity in all its beautiful diversity and drama.